The combat of Dragon's Dogma 2 takes the variety found in combat systems like Monster Hunter and Dark Souls and adds another layer to them in a pretty interesting way. On top of this, it introduces dynamic boss fights that are influenced directly by how you choose to approach them. So with this in mind, does Dragon's Dogma 2 have the best combat system Capcom has ever made? We'll start by quickly explaining what vocations are. If you're already familiar with the system, just bear with me. The rest of this section won't make sense without a basic understanding of it. So vocations are effectively just classes. You can change them at any time throughout the game, and they give you different weapons, skills, and abilities. You can think of them sort of like weapons in Monster Hunter. But to really understand what sets these vocations apart, I'll need to give a few examples. With each example, it'll become more and more clear what Dragon's Dogma 2 does to set itself apart, so see if you can spot the trend before I reveal it later. Let's start with the Thief. This class is all about speed. You use this speed to both dance around your opponent and overwhelm them with endless offense. As a result, this is the only class in the game with a traditional dodge. You're able to quickly dash in a direction to avoid attacks, and unsurprisingly, it's quite effective. It's not just the dodge though. See, thieves live by the whole "the best defense is a good offense" mantra. My personal favorite attack that the Thief gets is Implicate, which can be used to grab enemies out of the air, pull smaller ones towards you, and even topple larger ones once they're off balance. It can be especially useful on flying enemies and quicker ones that are actively trying to flank you with their speed. It's an extremely versatile ability that allows you to keep up the pressure regardless of the situation or the enemy. Skull Splitter is another powerful ability that sends you flying into the air while spinning to deal serious damage. The nice part about this attack is that because it sends you so high up, you can actually use it to evade attacks or reach higher, more vulnerable parts of larger enemies. Now let's move on to the Fighter. The Fighter is the only class in the game with a shield, and they use that shield to great effect. Of course, you can block attacks, but you can also parry if timed correctly and do a plethora of other things with your weapon skills. You can turn yourself into an impenetrable fortress, you can use it as a battering ram to launch smaller enemies and topple larger ones, and you can even use it to launch your own allies into the air. Versatile as the shield may be, however, it's obviously not the main weapon of the Fighter class. That designation belongs to the Humble Sword, an all-around weapon that can be used to clear crowds, close distances with fast blitz attacks, and even deliver exceptionally strong single target damage. The Fighter is an all-around class that's not really bad at anything, and it's that simplicity that actually allows them to stand out among the other classes in the game. Lastly, I'll go over the Mage. I personally have never enjoyed using magic in games like this. It always feels very one-dimensional and boring. However, Dragon's Dogma 1 and now 2 have been the only games where I genuinely enjoyed playing a mage class. I think the reason for that lies not only in the variety of spells, but how you use them as well. So each spell has to be charged to use. This charge time depends on their strength, but you can hasten this charge by pressing RB. Doing so will rapidly lower your stamina. This by itself adds a layer to the magic system, as now you have to decide if you want to spend your stamina just to get a spell out quickly, or if you're willing to risk it and hold the spell for a bit longer to conserve your stamina. It even adds a risk-reward system, as you absolutely can increase your DPS by using this ability non-stop, but if you do, you run the risk of running out of stamina and being left wide open for a pretty long time. It's in this way that magic usage becomes both about managing what spells are best for the current situation and about managing your stamina so you can cast them quickly if and when you need to. But let's talk about those spells, since the effects are pretty varied. There are two categories of spells: damage and support. These are pretty self-explanatory. Damage spells are things like Flagration, Leaven, and Frigger, spells that, if you can believe it, damage your enemies. Support spells, on the other hand, are a bit more varied. Empyrean summons a massive orb of light that illuminates the surrounding area. This is especially useful at nighttime or in caves. The boon spells, Fire, Ice, and Lightning, all enchant the target's weapon with their respective element. Palladium is my favorite one though, as it conjures orbs of light to protect you from attacks. The mage shouldn't really be close enough to get hit regardless, but this can act as a wonderful last line of defense in case enemies ever try to beeline it straight towards you. Now you might be able to see the trend here already, but if not, it's probably because you're not using today's sponsor, ExpressVPN. So what exactly is ExpressVPN? Well, a VPN is a virtual privacy network that does two things. First, it hides your internet activity from your ISP by rerouting 100% of your data through a secure encrypted tunnel. This is pretty cool because not only does it block their ability to monitor what you do online, but it also prevents them from selling your personal data to advertisers, which is, surprisingly, legal in the US. The second and most important thing that it does is allow you to change your location and access region-locked content from around the world. You see, the internet is filled with content. It almost seems like an endless ocean at times, but what if I told you the content you're seeing right now is actually just a content pond in comparison us into the content ocean that exists out there. The tip of the iceberg, one might say. I say this because of the unfortunate reality that is region locking. A massive amount of content on the internet, especially on paid streaming apps like Netflix, Hulu, and Disney Plus, is currently region locked. This means that these apps are preventing you from seeing thousands of other titles available on the platform simply because of where you live. This is where ExpressVPN comes in. You can use ExpressVPN to change your online location by connecting to one of the servers located in over 100 different countries. All you have to do is a quick search to figure out which country has access to the region locked content you want to watch, connect to a server in that country, refresh the app, and it pops right up. Let me give you an example. If you're into anime, surely you've heard of free rent. And if you're on Netflix, maybe you've even tried to find it there. If you did, however, you'd be a bit disappointed, as unless you live in Japan, it's likely not available to you otherwise. But if you were to change your location to Japan using ExpressVPN, now it is. Without ExpressVPN, you're missing out on the ocean of content that should be available to you. So go to expressvpn.com/spooser to see how you can get 3 months of ExpressVPN free. You can also click the link in the description or in the pinned comment. Okay, obviously these classes are different, but what stands out to me the most are their methods of avoiding damage and how that naturally leads to each class playing almost a different game entirely. In most games like this, Elden Ring for example, every class has the same base moveset. Everyone can sprint, jump, and most importantly, roll. The method by which you avoid damage is effectively the same no matter what class you play. And while there is tremendous variety in a game like Elden Ring, the same fundamental rules apply for each class. This is where Dragon's Dogma takes a different approach. As I mentioned before, the Thief is the only class in the game with a traditional dodge, and that's because the Thief's specialty is agility, so giving them a dodge as their evasive tool makes sense. The Fighter on the other hand has to use their shield and certain attacks to avoid damage, and the Mage has to keep their distance and take advantage of their spells to keep themselves safe. It's not just these three classes though. Every class in the game has some sort of unique way to avoid damage, and it's because of this simple surface level change that when you switch from one class to another, it's almost as though you're playing an entirely different game. The Fighter feels like you're playing Dark Souls, the Soldier feels like you're playing Monster Hunter, the Mystic Spear Hand feels like you're playing Devil May Cry. I mean, it's absolutely brilliant. Everything from your attacks to your methods of preservation to even your role in combat is dependent not just on these vocations, but how you choose to play them. And it's because of all of this that the combat feels more varied than even games like Monster Hunter. But all of this is only half the combat. To truly answer the question from the start, we need to look at the bosses. The part of the game that shines brightest, but might also be the most disappointing. The bosses are pretty phenomenal. They're some of my favorite boss fights in any game, and the stories that you're able to tell thanks to how these bosses are designed are among some of the best I've ever seen. The reason I love these bosses so much is because of how they allow you to really experiment with the combat. One of my favorite early game examples of this that I mentioned in my review that you should go watch was when I fought an ogre. The ogre is an agile enemy that can jump all over the battlefield and sprint faster than you can. I used the game's climbing mechanic to take advantage of its agility, however. I could make an entire video on the climbing mechanic, but to keep things brief, it allows you to climb onto larger enemies and attack specific weak points like the eye of a cyclops. In this case, I used it to climb onto the ogre and knock it down to the ground when it tried to climb onto a wall. There are even special attacks that you can use while climbing. The Thief has an attack called Powder Blast that you can use to plant a small bomb on the ground. If used when on a large enemy, you plant the bomb on them, detonate it, and even knock them off balance when you do. And while we're on the topic of knocking down bosses, that's an integral part of the combat as well. Larger attacks knock bosses off balance, and if you hit them with certain attacks or just swing hard enough, you can send bosses tumbling to the ground, leaving them wide open for a powerful finisher. See, this is what I meant at the start when I said the boss fights are dynamic. Let me sketch it out for you. See, this is a normal boss fight. HP goes down, maybe they enter a second phase, and the fight ends. The bosses in Dragon's Dogma look kinda like this. This doesn't make any sense. Scratch that. Okay, what makes the bosses here stand out is that there are multiple paths you can take. See, that's what the blue lines are. Forget it. Maybe you'll knock down the boss, maybe you'll hit their weapon out of their hand, maybe you'll jump on them and fly away into a different area. You get the idea. The fight is this hectic scramble where things are constantly evolving and changing, and that's what I really love about these bosses. But I did say they also might be the most disappointing part of the game. The reason for this lies in variety. The problem of boss variety in this game is significantly better than the first one, and I truly can't stress how great the bosses on display here are. Dragon's Dogma 2 takes a quality over quantity approach, and it creates a dozen phenomenal, deep, and exciting boss fights, but the problem is that there are only about a dozen of them, and as a result, you'll end up fighting the same ones pretty often. This isn't a huge deal for me because of just how much fun these bosses are, but depending on how much you value enemy variety, this could be a real problem for you. So now that we understand the combat system of Dragon's Dogma 2, is it the best system Capcom has ever made? I honestly think that's going to depend on what you value, but my personal answer is no. The boss variety hurts a bit too much for me to call this the best, but I'll be honest, if someone did say this was Capcom's best combat, I think they'd have a very strong argument. And while I don't think this is a strictly better system than anything else Capcom has made, I do think it's so different and so exciting that it might be my favorite. Anyway, if you want to know more about the game outside of the combat, check out my full review here.